Anyway, why don't we get started? I just want to remind you where we are. We're in chapter 21, 2 Samuel, and we read the first, I think, six verses. And basically, the story is that there's a terrible famine 3 years in a row. David turns to God, and God says that the reason for the famine is a terrible thing that Saul did in murdering Gibeonites. And this is the first we hear of this kind of a murder, and we put forth a number of theories of where this could come from. What we did see is evidence of what seemed to be a feud or a long-lasting kind of problem between the house of Saul and the Gibeonites. So we studied this a bit, and one of the things that is very important to remember, excuse me, is that we're not just talking about a murder, okay? It's not just that Saul murdered a bunch of people and therefore their relatives or whatever are looking for some kind of compensation or some kind of punishment for those who murdered. Very important to realize here that we're talking about the breach of a covenant, okay? And we see that in why am I not seeing it? Here it is in verse 2. Now the Gibeonites were not of Israelite stock, but a remnant of the Amorites, so to whom the Israelites had given an oath. And so very, very important part of this whole story is that whatever it is that Saul did, and whenever it is he did it to the Gibeonites, he was breaching the oath that had originally been made by Joshua on behalf of Israel to the Gibeonites. So that's very important. Okay, but it's very clear that God is expecting David to appease the Gibeonites. It's the anger, it's the sense of betrayal that the Gibeonites are feeling, not only because of the death of these people, but because of the breaching of this oath that is causing this famine. And God is expecting David to appease the Gibeonites, okay? And we're reading through the whole story, and what you may not see in your Bible, but it is in the Hebrew Bible, is in verse 6, there is a space in the middle of the verse, so that it starts like this: let 7 of his male issue be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And then there's a space as if it's a new sentence or something, and the end of the verse, and the king replied, I will do so. But the English that I'm reading for, it says, I will do so. The actual word in Hebrew is ani atain, I will give. And this verb give is very critical because we see this verb a lot. The beginning of verse 6, I will now read it using the word give as it is in the original Hebrew. Let 7 of his male issue be given to us, and the king will reply, I will give them. Okay, so they are expecting to be given, and he said he will give. Now, normally the verb give is used in a very gracious way. When you think of somebody giving, you're thinking of generosity, you're thinking of kindness, even beyond the requirements of the law. If you owe somebody, you're not giving them something, you pay a debt. But when you give something, it's beyond anything you have to do. Here, the use of the verb give is, number one, in a very cruel situation. They're demanding to be given these people in order to kill them, and David is going to give them these people to be killed. So it's a very harsh kind of contrast, but use of the word give with respect to what is really going on here. Okay, now okay, one more thing let me continue reading on now, verse 7. The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between the two, between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. Now, what's going on here? David has to find 7 descendants of Saul and give them to the Gibeonites to be killed. So as he's surveying who are the surviving sons or descendants of Saul, he remembers he has an oath between him and Jonathan that he would never destroy or kill his descendants. And remembering that oath is of course what saves Mephibosheth. Now, again, what we have here is very interesting because the whole problem began with the desecration of an oath, and here in the process of David making some kind of expiation for that desecration of the oath by Saul, he himself is making sure to preserve the oath that he personally entered into with the house of Saul. Instead, the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the two sons of the Armoni and Mephibosheth, the two sons that Ritzpah, daughter of Aiah, bore to Saul. And the 5 sons that Merav, daughter of Saul, bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Mecholathite, from Mecholah. Okay, so Ritzpah was a concubine of Saul, and so he takes her sons that she bore to Saul, plus 5 sons, and here it's a little bit weird, because it says there's the sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul. We know that David himself was married to Michal, but we also know scripture is very clear in saying that Michal never had any children. Also, Adriel from Mecholah was actually Merav's husband, not Michal's husband. And so what many people interpret here is that it's actually the children of Merav, but it's possible there's a number of different interpretations, but the one that seems most logical is that Michal was the one who actually raised them. It's possible Merav died young, Michal never had children, and so Michal then became a sort of mother to these children. Verse 9, and he handed them over to the Gibeonites. They impaled them on the mountain before the Lord. All 7 of them perished at the same time. They were put to death in the first days of the harvest, the beginning of the barley harvest. Okay, before I go any further, I just want to talk about something I forgot to do before. We're talking about 7. They asked for 7 people to be handed over, and we see in these verses that actually David hands over 7. Is there any significance to the number 7? Now, in the interpretation that we suggested last week, one of the sources of this whole feud with the Gibeonites, one of the possibilities was that these were referring to certain people who, as a result of that oath, they were going to be water carriers and wood hewers, and they would have served in the tabernacle with doing those jobs, serving in the tabernacle, and which is why then they would have been in Nov. The theory goes that these were Gibeonites, not the whole group of Gibeonites, but this interpretation says there was actually 7 people who had specific jobs connected to the altar that was in Gibeah, in Nov. And that was the situation. So in that case, the number 7 is not a symbolic number, but you killed 7, give us 7, okay? But there are those who see it as a symbolic number. 7 very often symbolizes, certainly biblically symbolizes the completion. There's 7 days of the week, etc. Now, it's also in Hebrew, the word 7 is sheva, and the word for an oath is a shvu'ah. And it's the same letters. It's the same root, even though they have 2 different meanings, the number 7 and the word for an oath. Now, actually, there's a theory that there is actually an etymological connection between those two words, in that when somebody was going to enter into a covenant with someone or enter into a formal oath arrangement, it was customary that they would transfer 7 things, 7 animals or 7 something. And if you recall, in the story of Abraham and the Philistines, at Beersheba literally means the well of 7, but when it gives the name to the place, it's reminiscent of the oath that was carried out there. And also at that time, there was a gift of 7 sheep, I believe, that was transferred. So that creates, it could be that was the accepted way of doing things in those years. It wasn't just that Abraham and the Philistines came up with this new way of doing an oath, but that's what it was. And so even in the name Beersheba, we see that name refers both to the number 7 and to the oath, because those two things come together. So those are just some ideas of what the number 7 means. Okay, now, one other thing, okay, and I'll get to that later. Okay, now, one of the other questions that comes up here that I think enriches us by seeing this connection as well, we mentioned that this chapter is considered an appendix to this, and the following chapters are actually an appendix to the book of Samuel, in the sense that they are not necessarily in chronological order. So a very natural question that arises is, when does chapter 21 take place? When does this whole story take place? And one of the commentaries that I saw that I thought was fascinating referred it back to the story of Shimei, son of Gera. Okay, now you recall we just finished that story in a previous chapter. If you look at chapter 16, okay, where is it? Chapter 16, verse 6. Okay, we're seeing here as David is running from Jerusalem, he encounters Shimei, and Shimei is a Benjamite. And what does he say? Verse 7. And these are the insults that Shimei hurled at David. Get out, you criminal, you villain. Now pay attention to this. The Lord is paying you back for all your crimes against the family of Saul, whose throne you seized. Okay, now the actual words in Hebrew, when it talks about it says the word criminal is what I have in my English, but the actual word in Hebrew is man of blood. Okay, a man of blood. In other words, a man with blood on his hands. Okay, it's the same word that we have in our chapter, the first verse. The first words, it says, it is because, and in the English I have the blood guilt of Saul. Actually, the Hebrew is the house of blood. So here we have a man of blood and we have a house of blood. Okay, and they seem to be connected, even though in the case of Shimei, when he says man of blood, he's referring to David. And in our chapter, the house of blood is referring to the house of Saul. But there are those that connect the two and say that this story actually took place before the revolt of Absalom. And that when Shimei comes out of his house and yelling and screaming at David and accusing him of being a bloodthirsty person versus the house of Saul, that he killed the house of Saul, we have to sit back and we have to say, that's absolutely not true. We know that throughout the entire story of Saul chasing after David, David had a couple of opportunities to kill Saul, and he refused because he said, this is an anointed of God. He's the anointed king of Israel, and he refuses to harm, not just to kill him, he refuses to harm him in any way. And the most he does is he cuts off a corner of his garment, okay? Now, Ishbosheth, which is the son of Saul that becomes king after him, is not killed by David. He is killed by two fellows that we discussed last week. Seems they were probably Gibeonites, okay? And in fact, when it comes to Mephibosheth, who is the son of Jonathan, we see in, if you look now quickly in chapter 19, verse 29, we hear what Mephibosheth is saying. He said, for all the members of my father's family deserved only death from my lord the king, yet you set your servant among those who ate at your table. What right have I to appeal further to your majesty? In other words, it's clear not just that he saved him, but that you could have argued that somebody like David, who was being chased by Saul, would have been justified to not just kill Saul, but to kill his whole family, and he clearly didn't. So then you have to ask yourself, what is Shimei talking about here? That David is a man of blood and has directed this blood vengefulness, whatever, against the house of Saul. And so the theory goes that this story that we're referring here happened just before this. And so therefore, what Shimei is referring to is the handing over of these 7 surviving members of the house of Saul to the Gibeonites to be murdered. And that, of course, makes us much better understand the anger and the resentment of Shimei against David. And it also gives us a little bit of context here, because as much as we look at this story and we are very troubled by it, I think by the same token, if we see it that way, we can see that the way Shimei would have looked at the story may have been what certainly the house of Benjamin would have looked at it in that way. But it could be many in Israel would have seen, what is the king of Israel, King David, doing, handing over 7 people to be killed by the Gibeonites? Just handing them over, okay? So I'm keeping that as an additional question in the air. Okay, so now let's go to the next part of the story. Then Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock for herself, and she stayed there from the beginning of the harvest until rain from the sky fell on the bodies. Now, the word here for rain falling, okay, on them is not just, it's a very harsh word. The word is nitach. It's rain striking down, okay? It's a very harsh word for something coming down. It's not only for rain, okay? It's a kind of word you would use for a rock slamming down against the earth, okay? This is a very harsh and violent sort of rain. She did not let the birds of the sky settle on them by day, or the wild beasts approach by night. David was told what Saul's concubine Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, had done. And David went and took the bones of Saul and of his son Jonathan from the citizens of Yavesh Gilad, who had made off with them from the public square of Beit Shan, where the Philistines had hung them up on the day the Philistines killed Gilboa. Now, you may remember that as part of that war with the Philistines, when Saul saw his end was near, he fell on his sword, and the Philistines found the body of him and his son Saul and hung it up on the walls of Beit Shan. And it was the people of Yavesh Gilad, who are from of the tribe of Manasseh, but they're related to the tribe of Benjamin, because at the end of the story of the concubine of Gibeah, okay, they're a group of people who never entered into that oath that they would not marry into the tribe of Benjamin. And so one of the solutions at that point was that they marry. And so those families are interconnected, the families of Yavesh Gilad and the family of Benjamin, which of course is also Saul. And therefore they come and they take the body down. And we also see that as a kind of a paying back with some kind of a graciousness, favor, whatever, to Saul, because Saul, when he first becomes king, goes after the enemies of Yavesh Gilad as they're being attacked, and he protects them. So that's the story that's being referred to here. So Yavesh Gilad had taken the bodies, but they never really buried them. They gathered the bones, they put them in a temporary place, but they were never buried with the family of Saul. And in those years, a family had a tomb or a crypt or something, and they would gather the bones after, usually it was like a temporary grave for like a year, and then they would gather the bones and put them into the family crypt, and that was never done. So the first thing that David does is not go after the bones of the 7 that Ritzpah is protecting, but first he goes and he gathers the bones of Saul and Jonathan. He brought up the bones of Saul and of son Jonathan from there, and he gathered the bones of those who had been impaled, okay, also those 7. And they buried the bones of Saul and of his son Jonathan in Selah, in the territory of Benjamin, the tomb of his father Kish. And when all that the king had commanded was done, God responded to the plea of the land thereafter. The assumption here is not only that, in other words, it mentions specifically that Saul and Jonathan are buried in the land of Benjamin, but the assumptions is when they said they did all the king had commanded was done, that they gathered all the bones and they brought them to proper burial. It may not be in the same grave, it could be nearby, I don't know, but they clearly were brought to proper burial. And after that, God responded to the plea of the land thereafter. Okay, so a couple of things here. So first of all, you can see how terrible the story is. Not just that David, they impaled them. It wasn't just that the Gibeonites, it wasn't just they killed them, they impaled them. And then Ritzpah goes and collects their bodies and protects them from the vultures. And there's absolutely no burial of these bodies until the end. David does not interfere. Clearly, the Gibeonites have no interest in burying them. It does remind us of the way the Philistines treated the bodies of Jonathan and Saul, also not bringing them to burial, putting them out for the vultures to get them. And it's the people of Yavesh Gilad that saved them from that, very much parallel to the people, to Ritzpah, who is protecting these bodies from being eaten and their bodies desecrated by the vultures. And then this comes to the attention of David, and you have a sense of correction, a sense of, bringing this to a somewhat better close, in that he buries all 9 of them, Jonathan, Saul, and the 7, he buries them. And only after they are buried do we have this statement that God responded to the plea of the land. So if in verse 10, we saw a violent rain, okay, this is not, in Hebrew, we have a expression that's called rains of blessing. Rains of blessing means the kind of rain that the land needs to be fertile. Not rains of blessing could be unusual storm where there's damage, like a tornado or a hurricane or something like that. That is clearly not rains of blessing. And so here in this idea of this a violent rain that we see in verse 10, that may solve temporarily or bring some water, but it doesn't solve the problem. And we only see this idea of closure, this idea of God ending the famine in a peaceful way, in a way of blessing. That only happens at the very end of the story. So now I heard this next idea from this Jonathan Grossman that I studied this chapter with, and made a very, very interesting, brought forth a very interesting idea. First of all, dividing the story into 2 parts. The first part is a story that's really about law. It's a story that the Gibeonites are demanding of David the letter of the law. You broke this oath. You must make repairs. You must make restitution. You have to do something to appease us, to atone for the fact that not you, but your people, Saul, broke the oath. So it's a very legal kind of situation without any room for kindness, for compassion. David hands over these people because that seems to be the rule of the law. On the other hand, then we have this figure, Ritzpah, who is all kindness. She's also a woman. David is a man. Very often, men, I don't think that is actual true in real life, but symbolically, often men represent a tougher, more, by the book kind of an approach, and a woman, or more logical, and a woman will represent a softer, more compassionate approach. Interesting, by the way, the word for compassion, or not compassion, the word for mercy in Hebrew is rachamim, and that's from the root rechem, which means womb. Okay, so the very idea of mercy or compassion is connected in the Hebrew language to the womb, to a female, characteristic. So we have David on the one hand at the beginning of the story acting out according to the rules and coming to a very, very devastating conclusion. The second part of the story, which doesn't fix the first part, but brings it to a conclusion that has far more compassion, is all run by Ritzpah. And it's only after David comes and basically responds to what Ritzpah is trying to say. She is saying they deserve a burial. They deserve to be mourned. They deserved to be respected. And it's only when David then comes to her and gathers the bones, and in addition gathers the bones of Jonathan and Saul, we have a certain closure, and then we have that God has responded to the plea of the land. Now this teacher, Grossman, Dr. Grossman, he's a rabbi and a doctor, by the way, makes a very interesting comparison between this story and the book of Ruth. I won't go into all the things he brings up, but there are a few things that are very, very interesting. This story itself is wait, where is that? Here we are. In verse 10, okay, there's a note that says, she stayed there from the beginning of the harvest until the rain, okay, the beginning of the harvest. And it says in the verse before, in verse 9, they were put to death in the first days of the harvest, the beginning of the barley harvest, okay? And this idea of the beginning of the harvest is a unique phrase, and it's also an odd phrase right here, because how much harvest do you think they could have been doing at this point when the rain had not yet come and there hadn't been rain for 3 years? So it could be a time of the beginning of when the harvest usually happens, but I don't think there was a whole lot of harvest going on at this time. But we see a very similar phrase, the same phrase actually, in the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1, I have to find it. Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. Here we go. No. I have it marked in my Hebrew Bible, and I didn't have it. Now, you have it easy because your Ruth is in a different place than our Ruth. Your Ruth is right after Judges. My Ruth is stuck in the back somewhere. So I have to find it. 1 second. Wait, 1 second. I'm sorry about this. Anyway, you know what? I don't have to find it. You can find it. Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. And what we have there is, again, the same expression, the beginning of the barley harvest. And what's happening in Ruth is very much a story of a woman who brings compassion, who brings a whole different set of rules, okay? And the rules would never have allowed Ruth to come into Bethlehem. She was a Moabite, she was a stranger. By every definition, she should have stayed back. She breaks the paradigm because she wants to be with her mother-in-law. She wants to help her mother-in-law. And the whole story develops in the way that she brings her desire to help her mother-in-law, to see if there'll be a continuation to the house of Naomi and Boaz and Elimelech, etc. And it also, by the way, the story begins with a famine. Okay, so it's just a very interesting kind of comparison if we're thinking that in this story the actions of Ritzpah bring a sense of compassion and a certain type of resolution to what we have seen until now. And I would just conclude with the way in traditional Jewish sources, when you stand back and you look at the whole story, and it's a terrible story, and you have to ask yourself, why is it that God would have brought this famine? And why is it that the only way to get rid of the famine would be to appease the Gibeonites, when the Gibeonites themselves are asking for something so immoral and so terrible, to kill these 7 people? And the answer that is given in many different varieties, but the basic answer that is given is the severity of the breach of the oath is so great that it overrides the tragedy of killing these 7 people. Why is the severity so great? And it is particularly because this was an oath that was given between the house of Israel and another nation. Okay, and it was an oath that was given in the name of God. And therefore, it's as if that God's name would be desecrated if indeed the house of Israel were to breach this oath. The Israel that is supposed to stand for justice, that is supposed to stand for honesty, that is supposed to stand for keeping your word, okay, to another nation in particular, breaching that would create a desecration of God's name that would be greater damage than killing 7 people. Okay, that's the overall way that it's looked at. I personally have a lot of trouble with that approach. I like the fact that, and I think it's very true, the way, if we look at the way the chapter is set up and the use, this whole idea of the oath and the sanctity of an oath, I think there's no question that this oath, the breaching of the oath by Saul, is extremely terrible. Okay, I still don't understand why the answer to that is the killing of 7 people, an answer which clearly God wants David to do. He wants him because at the end he brings the water. Now, he doesn't just bring the water when he gives the 7 people. He only brings the water when he also buries these people. Okay, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there is a famine and that is only solved after these 7 people are killed. So as I said, I'm leaving you with, even if we've gone in depth and I think we've learned, more and more about the story, I'm still left with this huge question. What do you say? Any brilliance?
Yes,
Yes.
I was thinking that when we read these stories, we read it with a lens of modern day sensibilities. And if we go back to the ancient time and we look around us, not only the Jewish people had these rules that they lived by, and I think David was working within the time of that. I know it's not something that I can accept at this point, in this, but I gotta take off those lens and look at what society was at that time. And that is how they made things order.
Well, I think I think there's no question, there is absolutely no criticism of David here
Right.
in the story. It's only somewhat subtle criticism is that it took Ritzpah to get him to actually bury these people. But there's no criticism whatsoever in him giving, these people over to the Gibeonites. But so and what's also very interesting, that are people, modern people, who are very critical of David in this story and who say David really was using this as an excuse to get rid of anybody from the house of Saul that could possibly, and that was a common thing, that, new king killed out the descendants of the previous king. But first of all, we know David wasn't like that. We see that. And also here, who are the 7 people he took? He took the children of the concubine, and he took the 5 children of Merav. Okay, none of these people would have been in line to be king.
Right.
They were outsiders. Okay, and so
I can
doesn't,
see him working with the order of the time. How just
right. No,
was
but
that?
so that's what I'm saying. I agree with you that David did the right thing, within the order of times. I would go further. He did the right thing because clearly it's what God expected him to do. My question is at God, because God is above the the way of the times.
Yeah.
If we didn't have if the story did not include the famine that is brought for 3 years and then afterwards is solved, both of which are clearly acts of God. If it didn't have that story, I would say it was all about what you're saying. David
but
doing what he had to do.
yeah, but you
Why
must
the
remember
famine?
in our Tanakh, we may question many things that God has asked us to do. You know, if
Right.
we go into the Torah, we see, when when the children were coming out of Egypt and they behaved badly, God sanctioned their destruction,
But because they sinned,
So,
that makes there is logic there. Here, these 7 people were innocent.
yeah,
That's the problem. Now,
that
again,
I
you
can
can
see that
say
problem. Yeah,
the answer can be we don't understand all of God's ways.
right.
That could be our answer.
Right.
But this is where I still have an issue. Anyone else with some
Yeah, this is
wisdom here?
April. I have a question. I have a commentary. Can I just read a quick sentence? How
Sure.
could these 7 people be executed for the sin of Saul? A court would not have the right to do so, but this was a heavenly imposed penalty, since the 7 were chosen by the Urim ve Tumim. Can you
Well, there
explain?
is there is no indication anywhere here that that's how the 7 were chosen. Now, it could be that that's relying on a midrash or something. I've not seen that midrash, but I don't think you need the Urim Tumim to know
What does
that
that mean?
this is the Urim and Tumim are the breastplate of the high priest.
Oh,
And we know that David had it because after the incident in Nov, when Saul had all the priests killed, there was one priest who survived, Abiathar, and he escaped back to David with the breastplate. So we know that David had it, okay, regardless of when this took place, he would have had it. But there's no indication here in the text that that's what he did. I don't think you need it, though. I think maybe what that commentary is doing is just to emphasize the fact that God is in this. Okay, God told it, because of the famine. It's the famine that tells us. And God's answer to the famine is because of the house of blood, it's Saul's fault and the blood that he put upon that he killed the Gibeonites. He's saying to him, you must expiate you must appease the Gibeonites. And I don't know, it's to me an open question that I have never succeeded in solving. And I have looked and studied and,
Could one equate that with the people often have a problem with in Esther, when the Jews were called to kill, everyone in sundry, whether they weren't guilty particularly, they just happened to be there, and it sort of ends.
Okay, I don't read it that way. I read it that the people who came up against them. Don't forget, there was Achashverosh and Haman put out a decree a year earlier on this day. All the people of the empire will be free to take up swords and kill as many Jews as they like. And then the king says, oh, I can't reverse my decree. So I'm going to let you take up arms and defend yourself. And so I read that as being they only killed the people who were coming up to kill them. They were not innocents.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a bloodbath.
It's just people. I know that some of my people I'm studying with, they have that problem with.
Well, it has been a classic. Claim of anti-Semites.
Yeah, no, this was not. This was
no. I'm not saying that the people who say it, but what's happened is it is kind of that interpretation, which I think originated with anti-Semites,
fits nicely into that.
Has entered the church, and I don't think it's. I think one thing that people say is, should we be, feasting after a defeat that included the killing of so many? That may be a question. I don't have a problem with this because I think that, when you defeat your enemies who are trying to kill you, then you can celebrate.
No, this was a Jewish rabbi point. So.
Yeah, but I've heard that. I knew.
So God knows the
It
heart.
says here, it says in Esther, I'm going back to Esther, Esther 9, okay? Verse 5, so the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, okay? And it keeps talking about their enemies, those who hated them and those who were their enemies. And so I think the understanding there is the people that came to fight up against them, not innocents.
Okay.
Yes, continue, yes. Lynn.
And slightly different subject. The Bible I use is obviously very different to the one you use, because when you're saying, in going back to 2 Samuel 21 verse 6, we've got giving, and I have got clear gap between whom the Lord chose, and then there's a clear gap, and the king said, I will give them, and then another clear gap, and verse 7. And
well, that's perfect. That's, in other words, what you have, your translation is much more, fitting to the Hebrew, to the original.
Yeah.
I find that a lot with things that you say. So, but one of the things is different. You mentioned impaled, and I've got hang. Did they? What? We've got hang. They hanged them.
Well,
we will hang them before the Lord.
Oh, it's well.
To be a maker.
So when you've got
and verse 9, is that what you're talking about in verse 9?
Yeah, no, verse 6, and yes, it happens again in verse. Yeah,
verse 9 in the Hebrew Bible.
No, verse 9 and verse 6, both of them have the same word.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not hanged. It's not hanged.
No. The impaling bit is horrible, isn't it?
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be impaled. It's killing them. It's definitely killing them with a sword, okay?
Right.
In front of, against the mountain, in front of everyone. It's the same word. Let's go back. I'll tell you where you can find the same word. I'm pretty sure. Okay, in the book of Numbers.
Yeah.
Do a little test on how the translations are there. Book of Numbers, chapter. Chapter 28. Okay. Numbers 28. The verse 4. What do you have there? Take all the ringleaders and have them publicly.
Oh, well, 28. Numbers 28, verse 4.
No, excuse me, not 28, 25. Numbers 25, verse 3, verse 4.
verse 4. I've got, and hang the offenders before the Lord.
So it's the same difference in the translation. It's the same word. Because it says, see you, whatever you do to them against the sun. Okay, up there against the sun. And then afterwards it says, so Moses said to the Israel's officials, each of you slay those of these men who attach themselves to Baal Peor. They're slaying them. They're killing them. They're not hanging them.
Yeah.
So whatever.
Right. And the other thing is, sorry, I understood, I think I understood what you're saying about the use of the word giving. It's not a nice kind of giving. It's a harsh giving. But what is the significance of that gap?
Oh, I think it's to kind of like there's a climax here. Okay. Right. They're making their demands and they're saying, and you're just like, oh my goodness, we're saying you better give us 7 people. And you're holding your breath. What's David going to say? And so the gap there is that holding your breath. And then the king says, I will give. And it keeps it in the same verse because it is in other words, they say and he responds. So it belongs in one verse, but I think putting the gap there basically says, oh my gosh, what is he going to say? Oh, and one more thing with the word of the giving that I did not, there was another word here where she said she wasn't going to give. 1 second. Delicious. Okay, no, I don't see it. But maybe it's not in the words, it's that, whatever. There is like a contrast with, oh, yes. So in 9, the 9, we have that giving again.
In actual fact, in some of the giving,
Oh, here it is,
I've got
here it is.
I've
Verse
got
10.
delivered.
Verse 10, when we're talking about Ritzpah, she
Yeah.
says,
Spread it over supper.
where's verse 10? There's a,
Okay.
and she says even that.
Hmm.
Okay. She did not, okay. Here you don't see it. In the English that I have, it said she did not let the birds of the skies settle on them. But in the Hebrew is she did not give the birds of the sky the ability to settle. So it's the same word. So David gives, but it's a
Right.
horrible give. And she does not give, but in her not giving, she is showing compassion. It's like an opposite. It's an ironic use of the word give. That those who
Right.
give are the ones who are really problematic, and those who don't give are the ones that are so full of compassion and kindness.
Yeah. Interestingly, in there, I haven't got the word where you just read out. I haven't got the word give. I've got delivered.
She did not deliver.
Yeah.
Okay, but in Hebrew, it's the same. It's the same give. It's the word give, natan. In Hebrew, it's the same.
Oh no! Sorry. Again in verse 6.
Verse
Let 7 men
10.
of his descendants be delivered to us.
Right, so it's giving. Right. Anyway,
Yeah, but
that's it. So we're all stuck with all our questions. I hope at least we had some ability to understand this a little better, even though we didn't understand it all, perhaps. We will take up next week with verse 15.
Right.
Thank
Great.
you. Enjoy
Thank you
the
very much.
holiday,
Thank you.
You're
the
welcome.
holiday of the tree.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.